our panelists for joining us for a very important discussion about the future of the past. Earlier, D. Ray said the following: we need to talk about how we got here. So for the next few minutes, our panelists have agreed to address that question. We begin with an observation from the summer of 1965. In an essay entitled "The White Man's Guilt," author James Baldwin makes the following observation: history, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways. And history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference and our identities and our aspirations. So I've asked our panelists tonight to reflect on James Baldwin's observation. And I'd like to begin with Professor David Blight, who lifted up this quote some years ago in an essay entitled "The Pleasure and Pain of History." Professor Blight.
Thank you, Bobby, and thank you to all the civic groups that planned this event. This is almost an impossible event to commemorate, but you're doing it, and bless you. I'm going to respond to the Baldwin passage, which I love, with another Baldwin passage. Baldwin also said in 1962, there's so many Baldwin passages we could use, but he said in 1962, the problem with the way Americans use words about the past is that they use them to cover up the sleeper, but never to wake him up. Cover the sleeper, but don't wake him up. How much truth in that? How often do we all want the past to just make us sleep well at night? To give us a story, a pleasant story, a story we want to live in. We don't like a past that causes nightmares. But of course it often does. If we're honest about the past, it will bring the nightmare. A quick little story, and we don't have much time. But on April 19, 2015, several of us on this panel were in Hampton Park up the street for a 150th anniversary commemoration of the first Decoration Day, which was enacted there on May 1st, 1865 by African Americans. I was one of two speakers. I was there simply to tell the story of what happened there in May of 1865, because I mostly discovered it. But the primary speaker was Clementa Pinckney. Reverend Pinckney gave an 11-minute homily, a brilliant homily, based on 2 Samuel, the story of King David and his son Absalom. Absalom, oh Absalom, my son, Absalom. It's the horrifying, terrible story of civil war. There are many of them in the Old Testament, but none more horrible than this. Absalom goes to war against his father, kills his brother in battle, and dies in battle fighting his father. Reverend Pinckney turned that into a story of civil war and how even something so horrible as fratricide can be reconciled. He made a very moving expression of healing out of that horrific story. And I stood at the end holding this program in my hand with Reverend Pinckney as we sang America the Beautiful and several other songs, including Eternal Father, Strong to Save. 2 months later, he was murdered. That day in Hampton Park, he chose that story from 2 Samuel, and in effect, He made himself into the reconciler. He even spoke very warmly of Confederate memory and the Confederate dead and equality with the Union dead. But the healer was himself, in the end, the murdered one. And that's what we're here to try to find some way, if not to explain, at least to commemorate.
Thank you. Ethan?
Can you hear me? I'm also tremendously humbled to be here. I find James Baldwin's moving words that Bobby read for us, they remind us that the past constantly informs the present. They inform who we are, how we see the world, and what we aspire to do, even if we don't fully realize it. And this insight takes on special meaning in a place like Charleston, which is so steeped in the past. More than any American city, Charleston doesn't let people forget about history. Packed with antiquated buildings and historic cities, Charleston beacons as a stepping stone back in time. And that's true not only for residents, but also for the millions of tourists who flock here every year. And this is an image that Charleston itself has self-consciously constructed. In 1924, Mayor Thomas Stoney proudly proclaimed Charleston America's most historic city. In the decades that followed, city tourism officials and operators and others promoted Charleston as a historical mecca, a place that could be enjoyed by all who came to visit. Yet the historical narrative that Charleston has sold over the past century has been woefully incomplete. Charleston has preserved the homes and privileged the stories of elite white residents at the expense of everything and everyone else. Charleston was the most important port of entry for the enslaved laborers who built this city and this country. Yet if you walk the streets of the peninsula in 1930, in 1960, in 1990, you have not have found a single memorial testifying to that fact. Charleston was ground zero for Reconstruction, a revolutionary biracial attempt to rebuild the country after the Civil War. But for almost a century, the city's tourism industry paid little mind to this slice of history. I'm reminded of a carriage tour of historic Charleston that Blain and I took in 2008. Our guide, as she steered the carriage south toward Broad Street, described the city's early demographics. In the 1700s, she said, the largest minority group in Charleston was the French Huguenots, who made up 15% of the city's population. Charleston, I would say, has a long way to go if it wants to truly live up to the billing of America's most historic city. And given that that is its self-proclaimed mantle, I think Charleston has a responsibility to do this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Blain?
Thank you. Can you hear me? So I would like to talk about some other memories that have been so important to other identities. For despite the power of this one-sided memory work that Ethan just outlined, Black Charlestonians resisted. They nurtured their own memories of Charleston's past. Memories that challenged the dominance, the distortions, and the silences of white remembrances. For years, for example, freed slaves and their descendants staged emancipation parades in the streets of the peninsula every January and July. These joyous celebrations punctured whites' claims that slavery had been beneficial for all involved, that the Old South was all moonlight and magnolias. And this was the reason that whites pushed these celebrations out of public spaces and into the privacy of black churches and black schools. Black Charlestonians also protested the city's most iconic memorial, the monument to John C. Calhoun, erected in 1887 in Marion Square by a group of elite white women. There, in the center of the city, was now a statue to a man who was a staunch defender of slavery, a man who once called the institution a, quote, positive good. Politically disfranchised because of Jim Crow, Black Charlestonians expressed their hatred of this statue by engaging in a campaign of guerrilla vandalism, a campaign that played a role in the decision to replace the statue in 1896 with the much taller memorial that still stands today. White Charlestonians, in short, hoped to put Calhoun out of arm's reach. While white Charlestonians did succeed at raising Calhoun to new heights in their ongoing efforts to justify white supremacy, to essentially use Calhoun to prop up 20th century segregation, they failed to keep him safe. The defacement of the second statue continued for decades. So what I'd like to really emphasize tonight is that resistance to Charleston's official version of its history is not new. The challenges to white historical memory that we have seen since the Emanuel Massacre 2 years ago have a long genealogy. And I think it's well past time to listen to these voices of resistance and take action, particularly when it comes to the city's commemorative landscape. Charleston cannot continue to whitewash its past. Exactly how the city should present its true, complicated, and often painful history is a good question, and it's one that we should probably explore tonight. But what can no longer be debated is whether we need to act. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Reverend Rivers, unlike others on this panel, this is your hometown.
Absolutely. Well, I'm not a been-ya. I'm a come-ya. But I come-ya when I was 3. And so I'm challenged with the whole concept because Clemente Pinckney was a friend and a brother. We stood together exactly 1 week before he was killed behind Governor Haley signing the body camera bill. And the last Democratic governor of the state, Jim Hodges, we met in his office, Senator McConnell and Senator Corson, in a private meeting debating the Confederate flag. We launched a boycott against the state in 1999, really out of the frustration of fighting this battle from 1984. And Mayor Riley invited me to Sullivan's Island for the dedication of this monument to Africans who first came to Sullivan's Island, to the pest houses. And I was so struck by it, I said to the mayor, I said, Mayor, I'm just amazed that you all will build a monument to the dead Africans and insult their living descendants every day flying that flag above the Capitol. And the mayor was on the right side on this. He was with me, but he couldn't muster enough support. So we launched a boycott. And then, they're saying it wasn't going to work. But they finally realized when people started really pulling out, they needed to have a conversation. So Mayor Hodges, John Corson, Senator Matthews, Senator McConnell, we sat together with some folk in the Lace House trying to work this out. The amazing thing to me was Glenn McConnell sitting right next to me, and I'm sitting almost between McConnell and Corson. And McConnell says to me that he doesn't understand why I don't see how the pain of what happened to the Confederate widows and the Confederate soldiers who came broken, why I wouldn't want to honor that. And I said to him, Senator McConnell, don't have a pain contest with me. Because if you have a pain contest with a black person from Charleston, you got to lose. Because what you had is an inconvenience. I had hell. And for you to sit there and act as though I'm trying to take something from you is the height of what our dilemma is. Your perspective on this is you're trying to give honor to something to me can never be honorable. I just finished our 4th year of our what we call the Freedom Road Tour. My church, Circular Church, a couple of years ago, Rabbi Alexander and KKB went with us, and Danny Reed last year went with us from Unitarian Church. We were on the tour in 2015 when the murders happened. My wife and I were married at Mother Emanuel. Our oldest daughter was married. Her anniversary was the date 15 years before, the 15th anniversary was the day of the killing. So Clemente and I were talking about dealing with the issue of Charleston schools being so rigid in segregating, not educating black children. And I was saying to him when he got elected to the Senate that I wish you had been there before because you would have been the voice we needed to stop the compromise that really was not a compromise, although I think I'm here about it in a minute. You can't compromise if the folk who made you come to the table are not at the table when you cut the deal. That's not a compromise. That's a con. And so what I said to them was that you don't understand what that means in this way. The senator met with me upstairs and said to me, looked me in the eye and told me, as long as I'm in the Senate or around, that flag that they've moved from top of the dome, inside the House and Senate to the front, he said that flag will never come down. And I said to him, Senator, you don't know me. I'm from the state of Charleston. I'm from the land of never. And everywhere I go, people told me I'd never do this and never do that. And everything you said I'd never do, I have done or will do. And I don't know how it's going to happen or when it's going to happen, but the flag is going to come down. What I didn't know is that we'd have to pay so much for it. It was a bad bargain and a bad deal. This is my point. If the flag was bad after the death of the 9, it was bad the day you put it out there. What changed? So I just spent these days in Selma and in Birmingham and in Montgomery, and I had my young people with me, and I kept asking the question, who would say what they did to those children in Birmingham, what they did to the children in Charleston was right? It was wrong then. But now when you look back at it, you can see that it's wrong. Because the consensus is that it was wrong. So my point about the history is, they asked me, I came to 4 meetings about reconciliation. Everywhere I went, I left. We cannot be reconciled because we've never been conciled. I have never been your equal. I have never been broken in relationship with you because I didn't have a relationship with you. You cannot be my master and not be your property and call that relationship. That's property rights. That ain't relationship. And so what I'm saying to us is that when you want to deal with this question of history and what it does, you have to go back further than Charleston because Charleston is the Disney World of history. Ain't none of this stuff they're talking about is real or true. They're all made up, ain't got nothing to do with the truth. I took my mama wanted to go, my sisters over there made me go on one of them doggone tours. I hate them, never want to go. Mama wanted to do one for her 90th birthday. I'm going to see that as I go. And I'm so sick by the time we get halfway through, I'm about to throw up and leave. The woman says in the tour that the slaves who served the houses down on the Battery had better kind of slavery. They were really more like servants than slaves. Get out of here, girlfriend. You ain't never been a servant or a slave. You don't know what that means. You can't tell me that I'm somebody's servant and there's a good way to be a servant or a better way to be a slave. The fact of the matter is that you believe there are degrees of my pain shows why you have no idea what my pain is. Because the truth is there's never going to be a better version of slavery. Either I'm free or I'm not. If I belong to you, I'm always your property.
Thank you very much, Reverend Rivers. So, Senator Campbell, I've asked you to reflect on this observation by James Baldwin entitled The White Man's Guilt. And you told me earlier that this essay was written in 1965. A year before that, you leave Chester to go up to Clemson. Is that right?
That's exactly right. I was in Clemson in 1964. I grew up in South Carolina, and I've seen the things you're talking about. It was segregated schools. The blacks went to black schools, the whites went to white schools. I've watched it become integrated schools. I think we made a lot of progress. I hear the things that are said today, but basically, I know we got a ways to go. But I tell you what, we've handled things with grace. We've handled things with forgiveness that we've done. My first year in the South Carolina Senate, I've been there 10 years, I sat between Senator Malloy, who was up here earlier, and Senator Pinckney. I was with Senator Pinckney, Reverend Pinckney, probably at 5 o'clock of the day that he was murdered. And we talked before he left to come to Charleston to go to the Mother Emanuel Church to lead the Bible study. I was with him then. And we can go back and talk a little bit about the history of South Carolina, but folks, we've come more than you give us credit for, in my opinion. We still got ways to go, but if you go back to when we had the flag over the dome, I mean, there was a compromise to get that flag moved, and it was put up for the wrong reasons. I will grant you that in 1961, as the 100th year of the Civil War, but it took some actions, progressive actions, to get it moved. We still don't move at a rapid pace in the General Assembly in South Carolina, but primarily what the deal was, let's get that off the dome. Now, I happen to be the president of the South Carolina Chamber of Commerce when Governor David Beasley tried to remove the flag. And he called us over to the State House, and I was with him, with the incoming chairman and the chairman that would follow, Bill Amick, and Paula Harper Bethea would follow him. And we sat down with him, and he said, what is the chamber's position on the flag? I said, Governor, we will help you remove the flag. And he said, will you give me a vote on that at your next meeting? And we did. And we had a unanimous vote for the business community to remove the flag. Now, it didn't work then. It was when Jim Hodges was our governor that we finally got it moved. There was still resistance in the General Assembly. For the right reason or wrong
Senator,
reason.
you caught hell. You caught hell trying to bring the flag down at that time.
Let me tell you where I caught the most hell, and this is a true story. My name was put out on the internet.
I've read about you.
And essentially, I got more postcards from some group in Massachusetts than I did from South Carolina, condemning me for advocating the flag coming down. In fact, is Charlie Way and I guess it was Tony Denny, chaired the Heritage Foundation, which raised money to try to advocate taking the flag down. And I had some threats over it. I just told the guy from Massachusetts he was never going to come on vacation in South Carolina. And I told him, I said, look, I tell you what, I'll never go to Massachusetts if you won't come to South Carolina. I mean, but in getting the flag down, and I wasn't in the Senate at the time, neither was Senator Malloy, and neither was Senator Kempson. We came later. Senator Malloy's been there 15 years, I've been there 10 years, and Senator Kempson's been there, I think, 4 years or 5, going on his 5th year. But the compromise, win, lose, or draw, was that we will take the flag off the dome, and we will build the African memorial on the State House grounds, and we will put it on the monument behind the honoring the dead Confederate soldiers who fought in the Civil War. So that was a compromise to do it. Now, the other compromise is what is called the Heritage Act. Now, you saw what happened in Louisiana. You saw what happened when they tried to take those statues down there. There was all kind of ruckuses and demonstrations and everything else. What the Heritage Act says is that no Revolutionary War, War of 1812, Mexican War, War between the states, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, Persian Gulf War, Native American or African American history monuments or memorials erected in the state on public property or any of the state's political subdivisions may be relocated, removed, disturbed, or altered. Now, there's a way to get around this. Basically, they said no streets, bridges, structures, parks, those type of facilities could also not be renamed. The way there's a way to get around it, it takes a 2/3 act of both bodies of the South Carolina General Assembly. It takes 2/3 of the South Carolina House. It takes 2/3 of the Senate. Now, when Senator Pinckney was murdered, there was a vote. The Senate led the way to get the flag moved to the museum in Columbia. The vote to remove the flag was 37-3. Okay, 37-3. The House stumbled over a little bit, but they finally come to their senses and removed that flag. So, you know, in death, Senator Pinckney accomplished a lot, Reverend Rivers. He was the impetus to get the flag removed off the State House grounds. So, you know, he was a good friend of mine. I mean, I sat between he and Gerald my first year in Columbia, got to know them very well. We had a really good relationship, and we exchanged a lot of different things. And I love the man to death, and it bothered me to hell and back when he was brutally murdered, along with 8 other people, and the 3 survivors that people tend to forget about. There's 3 people that were in that church when it happened. And so, you know, at the airport, and in addition to being a state senator and being retired from Alcoa, I now run I'm the CEO of the Charleston County Aviation Authority. When you walk into the lobby, the main lobby of the airport, you will see an honor of those people that perished from the Mother Emanuel Church, and also recognize the survivors. So, you know, history's a funny thing. You still got a lot of folks in this state that would tell you that I'm not for hatred, but I am for preserving heritage. And so the flag would not have been moved unless all these things happened. So maybe we're slow to take action, but we do take action in South Carolina. Maybe it takes a tragic event. I hope not all the time, because we've come a long way, you know, Reverend Nelson, but basically we still got a ways to go, and we're not stopping. You know, I like living in this part of the world. I like living in Charleston. I like seeing the progress that's being made. Yeah, we're going to be slow, but I think we're in a lot of cases we're ahead of most states because we do work together. We have a good relationship between the Democrats and Republicans, between the blacks and the whites in the State House, and we're going to continue to make progress.
Well, let's address this relationship for a moment. And we have a lot that we want to cover, but in the words of my grandmother, we're going to cut across the field and delve into some critical issue. So today, when I was walking from here to the College of Charleston, I never paid attention. I'd seen it, but never paid attention to the statue in Marion Square, and certainly never saw the inscription on the statue of John C. Calhoun that says, "Truth, justice, and the Constitution." Truth, justice, and the Constitution. And Senator, you just referenced the Heritage Act of 2000, and you also referenced the ruckus and demonstrations around the country in places like Louisiana and elsewhere. And I wanted to ask the panelists to respond to the question that was asked of me: when will the John C. Calhoun statue be removed?
I don't think you will ever see it removed. I'm speaking
Repeat that one more
not
time,
from my
Senator.
opinion as much, but I can tell you this.
Well, you just said it will never be removed.
It takes a 2/3 vote by the South Carolina House and a 2/3 vote by the South Carolina
Reverend Rivers, he
Senate.
said never.
The land of
I said
never is
never.
where I live. And
It's an uphill struggle. It really is. And that's just the facts of life. All I'm quoting, and please don't, it's not necessarily my opinion. I'm just telling you what the facts really are.
But Senator, that's what the other senator told me to my face, that the flag would never come down. Now, I got a fundamental issue on the history piece about the Confederacy. It keeps coming up, and I'm probably tainted because I just came off this trip where they shot Mega in the back, they blew up a church and killed 4 little girls, and they buried the 3 young men at the bottom of that dam. But this is the issue. The Confederacy as a premise is the problem, because the Confederacy is built on one simple fact, or at least an opinion, that my people, and my ancestors are less than human. The only way you can justify blowing up the building, only way you can justify, in 1835, I have this law, I'm going to use it in my next panel. This is a state law that made it a criminal offense to teach a black person to read. Nobody else in here except black folk got this in their history. So when you're dealing with a situation where the structure and the system is in place to do one thing, to enforce the notion that you deserve less because you are less. So every time you use states' rights or heritage, that really is a farce to us because we know what you mean. We are able to read between the lines. We know better. Yes, the Heritage Act included all those things, but the Heritage Act was written for one reason: to make it a felony to take that flag down. Because they knew, as sure as I'm sitting here, if you're going to put the symbol up of the worst system in the history of modern mankind that made me the subject and made the world rich off my free labor and act as though I was down with that, then you're going to find I'm going to try every time I get to take the flag down. So what do? You make it a felony. Now, that was not to protect the Denmark Vesey statue. That was not to protect Mary McLeod Bethune. That was not to protect any black people. That's just stuff you put in there. That's called trickeration where I'm from. You're trying to fool me and you're thinking you mean me. You don't mean me. You mean that flag. But you couldn't say it in 2000 because it's not nice to be just a raving racist. You have to be a subtle racist, and so you have to subtly say things. You could say it outright. When I came up, you could say the N-word to my face. You could talk about me on television, call me Negra until the sun goes down. Now you have to say, those black people. But you mean the same thing. So when we start talking history, the challenge we will always have is we have a disparate view of the Confederacy and the war because you, my brother, you, my brothers and sisters, the one thing you will never have is you are defined as nothing because of who you are. You will never have that. And so until you understand, every time you tell us we got to like or accept the Confederacy, what you're really telling me, I have to accept the fact that you told me I was less than human. In fact, two Charlestonians, Rutledge and Pinckney, made the argument that led the Continental Congress to decide 3/5 of a person. They weren't talking about you, brother. They weren't talking about you, sister. They're talking about me. When you're talking about me, I need to be able to step to you the way you step to me. And so when you call me out like that, I can't let you change history when you're not changing the truth.
Thank you. Now, to frame this, Ethan and Blain, you've written at one point about the need to preserve a statue like that of John C. Calhoun. Recently, David, you led an effort, among others, at Yale University to change the name of Calhoun College. Let's have a conversation about why or when should the John C. Calhoun legacy be protected or be placed in a museum?
Well, I didn't lead that effort. I served on a committee, the purpose of which was to produce principles by which a name could be changed, although we knew we were going to change it. Now, I would recommend to the senator, and I mean, I'm not a voter in South Carolina, so I don't have a vote on when Calhoun comes down. However, I would recommend the report. It's a 25-page report of the Committee on Renaming at Yale. And we came up with essentially, after many days and hours of studying this problem, especially in universities, we came up with 3 principles by which a name, a site can be changed. One was rarity. You don't do it willy-nilly every day. 2 was non-erasure. If you do change a name, you have an obligation to educate about that which you've changed. But 3, in the middle, was, this was a tough one, but when the person or the name's principal legacy violates either your Constitution, your mission statement, or your operating values, you shall have the right to change that name. The kind of law you passed, with all due respect, is not unlike, of course, the power to amend the U.S. Constitution, which takes 2/3 vote and makes it rare. But just the very fact that you would pass a law to protect the names, I mean, what are you afraid of? To protect the names of every kind of site across the landscape, it means that you are at least aware of what you're up against. And the last comment, the Reverend makes such an important point about the Confederacy. 1,000 times in my life, I have said to students or audiences, why doesn't the Confederacy just go away? It only lasted 4 years, for God's sake. Well, it was a big deal for 4 years. But why doesn't it just go away? And the answer, of course, has everything to do with race relations. When the Confederacy existed, it existed as a slaveholders' revolution to create an eternal slaveholders' republic. They lost. They really lost that war. And ever since, the lost cause tradition has been a set of beliefs, mostly about race, in search of a history.
So Ethan and Blain, I want to read you quickly. if we do away with the monuments like the Calhoun statue, we risk erasing how these memorials reinforced racial inequality in the past.
Yeah, so I want to be clear about this. We wrote a piece making the case that communities might consider leaving up these statues that we deem odious, that represent bad history, in favor of contextualization as an option. So in saying that communities might possibly leave them up, I don't want to be misinterpreted as saying that we think these statues are okay. So the argument in favor of leaving up a Calhoun monument or Jefferson Davis or Beauregard or whomever would be to somehow contextualize these monuments and to state very clearly the political work that they did for so long. These statues were designed to suppress the fact and ignore the fact that white Southerners seceded from the Union in defense of slavery. It's very simple. And so they were put up to say the war was not about the defense of slavery. The war was about a defense of states' rights, some kind of high-minded constitutional principles. So for decades, these statues were in these very public spaces all over the South. And for decades, those statues did very significant political work. People walked by them every day, and they still do. And white Southerners and black Southerners were told this is what the war was about. It was not about slavery. So one of the risks in taking them down is that we sanitize the landscape and erase the fact that those statues were there doing that work for so long. So that is something to talk about and consider.
Ethan?
And I would add that one of the principles that you all came up with at Yale, that is to not erasure, to avoid erasure, is what we were really trying to get at. And I think it's worth remembering that there are upwards of 1,000 of these monuments and memorials to Confederate leaders and generals and the like, and soldiers across the country that were erected not immediately after the war in most cases, but decades after the war. These are artifacts not of the Civil War. They're artifacts of the Jim Crow South, of the segregated South, of the South that was lynching African Americans 2 or 3 people a week. And so my fear, our fear when we wrote this article was to say, what happens if we do take all those down? And I recognize fully that maybe the good of that, of people not being reminded by of what Calhoun stood for, by walking by him every day in Marion Square today, might outweigh the needs of history, of historians like us. But I fear that we would whitewash the fact that these monuments were erected, that we spent decades, America spent decades putting these up. Imagine if Germany had spent decades, 50, 60 years after World War II, putting up monuments.
But
the Nazi soldiers.
analogy doesn't work. Why? Because I'm telling you, take it down. Doesn't matter if you agree or not, because the flag, Calhoun does not insult you. Calhoun does not celebrate your degradation. Calhoun does not celebrate the fact that you were put down, kept down, and used and abused. So the first thing is, with all due respect, I frankly don't care if you agree. Take the flag, take the thing down. Now the other part of this is, though, really, look at what you, I follow your logic this way. I just got off the tour. There are many great monuments that have been built. Alex Sanders is a great friend, great president of the College of Charleston, founder of the law school. Alex's grandfather was a Confederate soldier. He came home, had to walk back from the war. And he said the only people who want to honor that are the folk who never fought in it. So we got a lot of toy soldiers, a lot of dress up on the weekend folk. It ain't got nothing to do with what really happened. It was so heinous that even the folk who were in it did not want to remember it or go back down the road. Fast forward.
Now, as a
why
son of
did
a
they get put
Baptist
up?
preacher, you don't cut preachers off, but I know that the lights up here is flashing, so we have 4 minutes.
American time? Or Confederate time? Which,
It's not our time.
I will take my little minute or so and tell you that you don't rewrite history by removing those statues, and you can say all you want to about it, but we need to learn from the past. If you don't learn from history, you're going to repeat it, and there's a lot of really ugly, brutal things that went on in the South, but it just wasn't in the South, but so many people in this state had family that were lost to the Civil War. I'm talking about whites, and they see it as heritage. They see it as honoring their family, and you can look at it how you want to, but that's exactly how they see it. And there is a way to get the statue taken down, but it takes a 2/3 vote. And I count votes all the time. I'm very effective in trying to get legislation through. And Reverend Rivers, I just don't see it happening. Unless we have a complete change in the South Carolina General Assembly, I don't see it happening, and that's the fact.
Professor Blight wants to chime in, and we'll start now with our concluding remarks.
I'll just conclude. I am all for writing better history, layer it, deepen it. But there's another monument in this town that I want everybody to go out and look at. It goes to Blain and Ethan's point. It's down in Battery Park. It's that incredible 1932 monument labeled to the defenders of Charleston, the one with the gigantic Roman soldier with wings and a Roman helmet looking out at Fort Sumter. You probably drive by it and never stop to look, but stop and look at the inscription on that monument. I urge you not to take it down because I use it so much to teach with. At least don't do it in a hurry. But the inscription at the bottom of that says everything about what the lost cause became. It says, "Count them happy who for their courage and devotion endured a great fight." Think about that. What was the Civil War? A great fight. What was it about? You don't know. What were its results? You don't know. That's what the war became in American memory. It became a great fight. It was about nothing but valor on thousands of monuments. Causes and consequences are not as easy to put on memorials and monuments, but it can be done. Next to that monument, think creatively. Imagine what kind of memorial and monument, maybe an entire museum, if Joe Riley and his team can pull it off, to the slave trade and slavery, can be the answer to the count them happy in a great fight.
Ethan and Blain?
Happy history is what we too often end up with.
I'm going to be very, very, very brief. I would say that the main point I would like to make about the question of whether we should take down monuments or not is that I think ultimately it has to be a community decision. I don't think scholars from outside need to be making this decision. I think people on the ground, people who it affects every day, should be making this decision. And if Charlestonians want to take down the Calhoun Monument, then maybe the way to do that is to push for some legislation to repeal this Heritage Act from 2000 or 2001 and give that a chance. And in the meantime, keep supporting putting up other monuments. And so I would add a plug, in addition to going down to the Battery, head up to Hampton Park and see the Denmark Vesey Monument, which took a long time to get up, and they wanted it right staring in John Calhoun's face, but they had to settle for Hampton Park, but it's worth seeing.
I would also make a case for local control of these issues, as long as the local choice is not to do nothing. I don't think that is something that we can settle for today. I would commend to you, for those of you who are interested and maybe have not been following along as closely as we have, what's going on in New Orleans. I think that what is happening there right now is potentially a real model for how a community can engage the spaces that are left behind when these monuments come down. And I commend to you Mitch Landrieu's speech, which he gave about a month ago when the Lee Monument was finally brought down.
Reverend Rivers.
My closing comment goes from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "A genuine leader is not a searcher for consensus, but a molder of consensus." Over the years, I paraphrased these powerful words with my own quote: "A true leader does not do what is popular and try to make it right, but a true leader does what is right and try to make it popular." taking Calhoun down is right. It's up to us to have the leadership courage to do it. And if it was wrong before, it's wrong now. If they found out that Calhoun was a dog abuser, they'd take the thing down.
Senator?
You know, I love the debate, and I love Reverend Rivers. I love talking with him. And, you know, we're going to agree and disagree, but what makes this country great is everybody has a vote. Everybody has a vote, and as long as there's enough votes to keep the statues up, they'll stay up. When there's enough votes to take them down, they'll come down. And I do give my really good friend, Clemento Pinckney, or Clem as we called him, I give him the honor because without him dying, I'm not sure the flag would be off the State House grounds. And so I don't want that to happen to push it, but he was a good friend, a good Christian person,